Hello and welcome to the podcast. The BBC needs more money and it needs your support. So last week, the corporation launched a new questionnaire, the biggest public engagement exercise, it says, that the BBC has ever undertaken. Account holders across the UK will start to receive an online questionnaire to help identify what they want from the BBC now and what they want from it in the future. The Beeb says its findings will help inform its discussions with government as part of Charter Review, following which the scale and scope of the BBC's services will be agreed and, crucially, how they are to be funded. And thereby lies the rub. Will a cash-strapped Chancellor find the money the cash-strapped BBC needs? In this podcast, we'll look in particular at whether there is money to be made out of BBC radio and podcasts. The scale of the BBC's reduction in funding was laid bare on Monday, when it published its annual plan. It paints a grim picture. No more savings to be made from job cuts, a drop in support for the licence fee, less money to spend on programmes at a time when industry inflation is accelerating. Perhaps the headline on the annual plan should have been one word: help. Well, who better to discuss the plan and possible sources of commercial revenue than James Cridland? He joined the corporation in 2007, working on the BBC iPlayer for radio, and he's currently the editor of Podnews, a daily podcast newsletter. He is a radio futurologist, a writer, consultant and public speaker on radio's future. James Cridland, welcome to the podcast and thanks for joining us from Chicago at an unearthly time in the morning.
It's a great pleasure,
Well, we're speaking in the context of the BBC's sort of annual report, really, which I read as a sort of, not quite a despairing plea for hope, but a pretty downbeat assessment. And the BBC is talking about its financial crisis. It's saying that there are no really more jobs to cut. It'll have less money to spend on programmes. So in that context, obviously, people will ask the question, well, how much money can it raise from commercial sources? And the answer is a fair amount, 200 million or something like a year, but nothing like the 3.5 billion it gets from the licence fee.
You're right. I think, it's interesting looking at those numbers. BBC Studios, which is the commercial arm, of course, gave 325 million back to the public service last year, which if you put it, I suppose, in terms of licence fees, that's £15 additional on your licence fee, which I suppose is one way of looking at it. But you're right, there is a certain amount of... I read the annual plan with a view that this is part of the negotiation between the BBC and the government for what comes next. And if you read it through that lens, of course, the BBC is going to be not necessarily painting the most positive picture in terms of its finances. One thing that I did see, which I thought was interesting, is that they say that there will be a 1% drop in licence fee revenue next year. Now, 1% is quite a big amount for a drop in licence fee, and the population of the UK is not, so far as I'm aware, going down. So therefore, that was an interesting sort of side note I felt in the annual plan there.
Well, it's a sense that the people, maybe optimistic, maybe more people than that will stop paying the licence fee. And of course, there's an awful circle here, isn't there, that the less money you have to invest in really popular drama, for example, then people say, well, actually, we're not getting anything from BBC we want to watch. We're getting it from Netflix, we're getting it from Amazon Prime Video, whatever. Why are we paying for the BBC? So it becomes a self-defeating circle almost. You have less money to invest, your audiences go down, the audience say, well, I'm not getting anything. And when can this stop? I read not the annual report, the annual plan in the same way that you did, which was basically Tim Davies saying, effectively, after 5 years of cutting costs, and there's no point complaining to a Conservative government about that, we've cut it to the bone. There are no more jobs to cut. We're pushing as hard as we can commercially, but we're just standing still and waiting to be rescued. Now, they've got money for the World Service just to keep it going while that issue's solved. They've got the licence fee restored to the rate of inflation. It'll go up again shortly by a small amount. But basically, they're just saying we're holding the line as much as we can. We're still suffering relative decline. Help. Now, if you're sitting in government and your chance of the Exchequer under the pressure she's under, it's going to take an awful lot to persuade you to put up, as it were, a tax at this time, isn't it?
It is. I think it's difficult, and I think it's not necessarily the BBC's doing, of course. I think one of the big problems that the BBC has is it has been reliant in recent years on making money from other broadcasters. I mean, obviously, if you have a look at many of the big shows that are on the BBC, the end credits seem to mention about 6 or 7 broadcasters across the world. And the difficulty is that obviously all of those broadcasters are feeling a pinch right now. So it's not as easy to say, you know, for the next Life on Earth, we will go and get tons of money from X broadcaster in one country, Y broadcaster in another country, and so on, when actually that money isn't there either. And I think this is one of the big squeezes that the BBC has, is less co-production money in terms of that, you know, really drives the bottom line of, if we're going to make these large, ambitious shows, the shows, as you say, that get people to watch the BBC's content in many cases, then we're actually losing partners across the world to help us afford that, because there is less money out there. And I think that's part of the whole media slowdown, which of course is going to impact how the BBC works.
Well, let's turn specifically to radio, and let's deal first of all with let's deal more generally with the question of whether it's possible to raise significant levels of revenue from radio and from podcasts, and look specifically at this concern there's been about what's going to happen to people who've previously listened to sounds abroad or from out of this country, haven't paid the licence fee probably, of course, and are no longer trying to get it. One of our listeners, Mark Galloway, the Executive Director from the International Broadcasting Trust, wants to know, there's an assumption that the UK licence fee payers are paying for BBC Sounds, which they are, but there is also an anomaly at play here, which has always mystified me. BBC Sounds is free to access for all in the UK, including non-licence fee payers. I don't understand why this is the case. So can you explain to us why we are where we are at the moment, whereby you don't have to pay the licence fee to access BBC Sounds?
Well, you don't have to pay the licence fee to access BBC Radio as a whole, of course. And the same goes for the BBC's website. The same goes for the BBC News app, actually. Technically, the law is that if you watch or record live TV on any channel or service, or you use the BBC iPlayer, then you're supposed to have a licence. But radio almost comes free with the TV licence. So I guess what you could be saying if you're working at the BBC is you could be saying, OK, well, this is easy. We will put all of these services behind a registration wall that requires you to type in...
That's bbc.com, yeah?
Yeah, well, no, that's all of the UK stuff.
Right.
The iPlayer, the BBC News website, bbc.co.uk. You could, if you wanted to, if you were the BBC, put all of those behind a registration wall that requires you to put your licence fee number in to prove that you're a licence payer. The closest that the BBC gets is, I have got a licence, yes, no, if you're using the iPlayer. So I'm told, because clearly I haven't used it for the last 7 years. So the BBC could do that. The problem is that there's no limit to how many people can be covered under a TV licence, because it's a household thing. So you could just share that number with your friend. And secondly, it means that it potentially cuts off more people with a TV licence because they can't find the number and they can't go through a registration process. Then it cuts off people without a TV licence. So I think from that point of view, the BBC is very sort of hamstrung in that, yes, it could raise theoretically more money from the UK for people with a TV licence, just to get them to prove the fact that they do have a TV licence. But at the end of the day, that then collides very much with the public purposes of the BBC as well. So I think we're in that sort of difficult position where the BBC isn't a subscription service. BBC Radio is free to all. Actually, BBC Television is technically free to all, but you need a licence fee if you're going to be watching it. I think that's the issue that the BBC has. But then, of course, there is overseas, which is a very different kettle of fish.
Well, of course, one of the central principles the BBC keeps restating is that public service means universality.
Indeed.
That means everybody having access. And on the whole, of course, we had a radio licence in the past, a long way in the past, but the BBC just basically said, it seems to me, well, we know how to have a TV license because you've got to have a TV set. If we were to try and find out everybody got listening to radio, whatever, oh God, this is impossible. The revenue's not going to be worthwhile. Therefore, let's just stick with the TV license. Yes. But you have that anomaly that, of course, people, if they don't want to watch TV, don't need to buy a license, can listen to BBC Radio. Okay, well, that's the situation here. But if you're abroad, until now, you've been able, via BBC Sounds, to listen to almost anything. And I used to, on feedback, get emails from people in New Zealand saying how fantastic it was to be able to listen to the Today programme or Des Down Discs or whatever. And it really made it a vast difference. Of course, they're getting it for nothing. A lot of these people would then say, yes, but we would be willing to pay. So do you think there would be any way of monitoring, if you decided not to cut off BBC Sounds and you decide to allow anybody around the world to listen in, would it be possible to have a voluntary subscription? Are there any ways of raising revenue from these people without putting BBC Sounds effectively behind a wall?
There is, and actually the BBC is doing it. So if you were to have a look at just purely podcasts for now, let's ignore radio, but the podcasts side, which of course from the BBC is mostly but not all catch-up radio. So it's radio which has been broadcast already, and we're going to cut that up and make that into a podcast. If you look at that, what is going on with that right now is if you use Apple Podcasts, you can pay the BBC some money through Apple Podcasts, and you get those podcasts without any advertising in there. It's the BBC Premium Podcasts channel, which they launched a couple of years ago through Apple Podcasts. And it is, so I'm told, one of the most popular paid-for channels on the Apple Podcasts app. So if you want to pay for BBC content without hearing lots of local advertising, and it is very local advertising, then you can actually get rid of that if you're using Apple Podcasts by paying some additional money, and that money, most of it goes to the BBC after Apple has taken their cut.
And will this podcast have to be edited at all in order to be available? Because we hear often about problems about music, for example, copyright and so on. If people pay Apple Podcasts, for example, are they getting the same podcast as we would get in the UK, or we would get if we heard that podcast actually broadcast on the regular channels?
So most of the time, what you hear in a podcast is what you have on the radio, for example. So if we were to take, I don't know, the news quiz, for example. The news quiz used to have a music round. The music round was just a little clip of a song. That is, pretty well okay in terms of the fair use rules and all of that kind of thing around the world. So that is fine. There are a few shows that the BBC makes that they put in BBC Sounds, but not in podcast apps, that have much more music in there. And those, well, we've not been able to access those on third-party platforms at all anyway. And of course, with the closure of the BBC Sounds app for people outside of the UK, that will go away. But the fundamental part of this is the BBC can charge for its own content, but the BBC can't very easily charge for other people's content that it is licensing. And that's the fundamentals of why the BBC Sounds app is going away outside of the UK, and why we are looking at a future where those of us who live outside the UK will get 2 live radio stations, one of them being the BBC World Service, of course, although which version I don't know, and the other version being Radio 4 itself. And I'm delighted that Radio 4 is still going to be available, because that's a fantastic station, of course, as you know. But it does mean that we're not going to get any of the BBC's music stations or BBC Local Radio or nations stations like BBC Scotland. So all of those are going away, primarily because the BBC doesn't own a large chunk of the content on those stations, which is the music. And so therefore it is very, very difficult for the BBC to all of a sudden start charging for accessing somebody else's content.
So, I mean, people would automatically think, BBC Local Radio, that can't cost anything, it's local news, whatever. But as you point out, actually, it's sustained throughout by music.
Yeah.
And if you don't have the rights.
Indeed.
So is this a situation where the BBC is switching off BBC Sounds Abroad, if you like, not because it thinks there's significant revenue, but because it no longer has the rights? Is that one of the key issues? It would cost it too much to get clearance to justify what it's doing.
Yeah, you've exactly got it right. And I should preface this by saying my understanding of this issue, I've been trying to talk to the BBC a fair amount about this. I've been a guest on a number of radio shows over the last couple of weeks talking about this. I have been talking to my contact at the BBC saying, please could you at least tell me what's going on so that I can at least give out accurate information. And they haven't given me any information. So let's just sort of say that, and also say I used to work for the BBC on radio streaming 20 years ago. So with those two caveats in mind, my understanding is yes, as soon as you put advertising around a product that has music in it, specifically, as soon as you put advertising around that product, so you might have, the BBC Sounds app might have some banner advertising in it, and when you start listening to Radio 2, you might get an ad for double glazing or something first. As soon as you do that, the record companies come to you and say, right, you owe us all of this money now because you're monetizing this particular stream. So the way that the BBC has been able to, in inverted commas, get away with making music radio available overseas is that no one was making any money out of it. And the record companies earn enough money, to be honest, from the BBC within the UK as well. So that's really the issue, that as soon as the BBC puts a single pre-roll ad on Six Music, then it has to pay for all of the music rights for Six Music. And that then also means, because you've got different rules and regulations in different countries, it would actually impact the domestic broadcasts as well. So, for example, in the US, there always was a rule that you couldn't play two songs from an artist back to back, which is a ridiculous rule, but nevertheless it exists. And so therefore, all of a sudden, you would have to be telling UK broadcasters, broadcasting to a UK audience, well, actually, you know, the US rules apply here. So it's a bit of a messy thing, which is why the BBC Sounds app has never contained any advertising, and which is why all of a sudden now we are seeing the BBC clearly wanting to monetize the large amount of audience that it has, but it can't monetize anything to do with music radio.
And by the way, I'm tremendously sympathetic to your difficulty of getting answers from the BBC, because here you are. It's a classic example, isn't it, where the BBC's enemies will be willing to pounce here. How outrageous it is, the BBC depriving audiences around the world. All you require is the BBC to get out and explain, as you have, the circumstances and the difficulties, which is entirely understandable, which is broadly will cost us vast sums of money in order to do this, and therefore we can no longer justify it, etc. No, silence. Anyway, all right, we passed by that because it drives me mad as well, continually about this.
But I should just say, it might not be all bad. Now, I got a briefing about what the BBC was planning on doing in February, and it was very careful, quiet briefing of something that we were about to announce, slightly overlooking the fact that they had put a press release on the BBC website 12 hours previous, which was slightly embarrassing for all concerned. But one of the things that the person that I was talking to said is, we're still working on international access for our music radio stations. And what happened last week, actually on the day of my birthday, which was nice of them, is that they very quietly changed the international website that has a lot of frequently asked questions about this. They changed that website ever so slightly to add a new paragraph which talked about third-party platforms. So that's things like TuneIn, or you can listen to BBC Radio through Apple Music, or smart speakers, which a lot of people use. And what this new paragraph says is, if you use a third-party platform, like a smart speaker, then you will still get access to BBC Radio and nothing changes. Now, it would be lovely if the BBC's press office would really clarify that and tell me, OK, so if I've got a smart speaker, it'll continue working. And if I've got access to the TuneIn app, it'll continue working.
So wherever you are in the world, it'll continue working.
So wherever you are in the world, if you are currently listening to the BBC on a third-party app, so something which isn't the BBC Sounds app, then this new paragraph is pretty clear in saying nothing changes. The only change going on here is that we're getting rid of the BBC Sounds app, and you have to use the not very good as a replacement bbc.com/audio. So if you're using a smart speaker or TuneIn, then reading that paragraph, you would expect that you will still be able to have a listen, which is brilliant, but they've kind of hidden that under a bushel. They only put that on the website last week, but that's a significant thing if that's what that means.
Well, I think a lot of people listening around the world would be absolutely delighted to know that. But, it's like, why do you have to, with BBC so often getting blood out of a stone? It really is getting information. There's no particular downside there, and no politician is going to hammer them for that, I think. By the way, while we're on podcasts, there was a BBC withdrew proposals to put ads on some podcasts last week because the industry here was very happy. Well, the revenue from podcasters, we know to our cost, is not great, shall we say, unless you're Gary Lineker and Goalhanger and so on. But why did this issue matter? What was that issue about?
So that was earning money out of people within the UK. So what the BBC decided that it would do is it wanted to be able to put advertising on BBC podcasts in the UK if you weren't using the BBC Sounds app. So if you're using BBC Sounds, you still get the shows ad-free. But if you were using Apple Podcasts, or if you were using YouTube Music, or whatever the other podcast app that you want to end up using, Spotify obviously, then there would be advertising in there, advertising on third parties. Partially, I think, to bully you into downloading the BBC Sounds app, which I have to say I've never been a particular fan of. But I think also, partially because that might have been a nice additional income for them. That's how they earn money overseas. There's plenty of ads in the shows that we listen to. So that was an interesting suggestion from the BBC. Now, of course, Gary Lineker and other people jumped up and down and said, hey, it's hard enough earning money without the biggest podcaster in the UK jumping in and saying, oh, we're going to take some advertising as well. And so there was a lot of hue and cry about this. There were a lot of people in the UK industry saying, absolutely not, you can't do that. And if you were to take that to the logical limit, then I think you could claim that broadcasting BBC television on Sky is third party because the BBC doesn't own the Sky platform. And so therefore we're going to put ads on the telly as well. So it was a very, very slippery slope. And I'm pleased that the BBC has seen sense and has decided not to put advertising on its podcasts on third parties in the UK.
Well, my conclusion from all this is that there almost will inevitably be a clash between the BBC's public service purposes and what it's trying to do and its commercial needs or imperatives, you like, and that in the area of radio, there is not a great deal of money to be made. If you were advising the BBC now, what would your advice be? To say, oh, give up in this area, it's not worth it. Basically, find an alternative to the licence fee. That's the most important thing. Get agreement on it. Do that. That's where the future lies. Continue to try and make money, obviously in what we would call visual content, if you like. But it's a gesture, the attempt to make money out of what we might call talk speech radio.
Well, there's still a fair amount of money to be made, I think. And it's odd. I actually wrote a blog post back in November saying I don't understand what the BBC strategy is when it comes to audio, but here's what I would do if I was in charge, and which thankfully I'm not. And exactly what I would do, getting rid of the BBC Sounds app overseas, is what has actually happened. So I see the need of the BBC to do this. The BBC has a good product. It's not necessarily as large as everybody that works for the BBC thinks it is outside of the UK, but that's by the by. The BBC has a good product, which it should be earning money from, and should be ploughing that money back into programme makers. That's, of course, what the BBC should be doing. So I do think that making money out of advertising in podcasts makes a bunch of sense, and they're doing that very successfully, is my understanding, doing a lot of tie-ins with local sales companies in places like the US and Australia and so on and so forth. They're doing that very successfully, it seems. The difficulty from earning money from live broadcast radio is twofold. Firstly, the BBC World Service is not there to earn money and has a very different strategy, which I don't think necessarily is fully understood by the BBC.com team, many of which are based in the US. So that's the first sort of side of it. And the second side is that there is nowhere to put ads in Radio 4 because it doesn't come with ad breaks built in. Weirdly, the World Service does, but Radio 4 doesn't. So you end up with this sort of peculiar thing of it's going to be very difficult for them to make money out of live radio, but in terms of making money out of on-demand content, much, much easier for them to end up doing that. To be honest, I think that they've got their strategy right. It's going to be very difficult for them to make money out of music radio, very hard indeed, because of the rights reasons. And I think the fact that you can listen to Radio 2 while you're, hiking up Mount Kilimanjaro is fine, but it's an accident of history. We didn't have geo-blocking when we started streaming live radio 25 years or so ago. But I think in terms of the strategy, which is to earn as much money as you can from audiences outside of the UK, I think it is the right strategy, I have to say.
And finally, on this point, though, I suppose if you did have subscription, and there are lots of arguments against subscription on the public service universality round, lots of people, quite significant people still had access to the internet and so on, and there are the dangers that if you do subscription, you tend then to direct your programme commissioning and content to what people would pay for, and you may then say the whole range of public service important things will not get paid for. But setting that aside, if you had subscription, would you in New Zealand be able to subscribe in the future, do you think, to a BBC Sounds or equivalent, and thus guarantee the fact that when you wake up in the morning, whatever time you do, and you switch on, you can feel that you're at home?
I think, unfortunately, it's not as easy as that, purely because of the rights reasons, purely because the BBC doesn't own the rights for a lot of the things that it broadcasts on the radio, and it just can't make that offer. I think it's different in terms of Radio 4, which is why it's there. It's different in terms of, clearly, of the World Service. But I don't think there will be a case where you end up being able to pay money to access more shows abroad. And also, I don't think the BBC Sounds app is big enough to actually make that a viable product anyway. If you were going to make money from live broadcast radio, then the BBC Sounds app, which is a tiny little thing which is really only there for the super fans of those radio stations. I mean, I launched the first streaming radio app for a radio station back in 2004, and what you learnt very, very quickly is the big fans of your station are the people who download it, but pretty well nobody else does, because why would they if they're just a drive-by listener? So you have that sort of issue that actually the BBC Sounds app by itself isn't big enough, and really there isn't an app out there that you could pay money to and get a bouquet of radio stations in the same way as there might be for TV. The closest we get is TuneIn. My understanding is, having read the reports for that, is that TuneIn has never made any money and has a bit of an issue there in terms of that, and has made an awful lot of job cuts over the last couple of years. So the reality, I'm afraid, is I think there are a lot of diehards who would be very happy to pay $7.99 a month to be able to wake up to Scott Mills. There are a number of people like that, but they are a very small number, and the costs in doing so are so high and the rights are so complicated that really I don't think it's going to be a goer, unfortunately.
So we better get on with deciding whether we're going to have the licence fee continue or another, because clearly what you've described is perhaps valuable contributions to the BBC income, but in no sense a replacement for the fundamental licence fee that we get, or for some other form of tax. Right. Well, James, thank you so much. I see dawn has come up behind you now in Chicago. It's presumably breakfast time. Thank you for postponing your breakfast. Great to hear from you.
It's been great to be on. Thank you so much, Roger.
Our thanks to James Cridland of Podnews. So if you're in danger of losing BBC Sounds, get a smart speaker. You don't have to pay the licence fee for our podcast, of course, but for less than the price of a cup of coffee each month, you can support us. You can do this by either a one-off payment on our crowdfunding page, or regularly by signing up to patreon.com/BeebWatch for £1.99 per month. By signing up to Patreon, this will also entitle you to my weekly blog, which gives my take on the week's interview. The link to this and to our crowdfunding page can be found in the description of this programme. And that's it for this week. As you probably know, this podcast is presented by me, Roger Bolton, and it's produced by Kate Dixon. The The sound is by Dave Kitto, and special thanks to Quinn Genti. It's a Good Egg production. Until next time, goodbye.